The roaring blaze of alien sunlight filtered through the translucent walls of the veterinary dome on Trevon IV. Inside, Dr. Ethan Cole, a seasoned human veterinarian, carefully examined the chart for his next case. It was supposed to be a routine day, but a commotion outside suggested otherwise. The double doors hissed open as two towering Kormathi rangers, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming, burst into the room carrying a massive creature on a hover stretcher. The beast was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Nearly 5 meters long, its fur was a mosaic of iridescent blue and black, rippling with muscles beneath. Its 8 legs ended in razor-sharp claws, but the most alarming feature was its state. A patchwork of vicious gashes crisscrossed its body, oozing a thick golden ichor that stained the stretcher. "Human," one of the Kormathi snapped in a clipped tone, its mandibles clicking in agitation. "This is a Mazoran bearhound, apex predator, gravely injured during a territorial conflict. Our chief vet, Dr. Kalin, has deemed it beyond saving." Dr. Kalin, an esteemed alien veterinarian of the Lyrac species, followed the rangers inside. His elongated frame seemed to glide as his pearlescent eyes locked onto Ethan. "The Mazoran is as good as dead. The wounds are extensive, the organs failing. I recommended euthanasia, but the rangers insisted on one final attempt. Your attempt." Ethan pushed his chair back and approached the creature. The sheer size of the Mazoran was intimidating, even in its weakened state. Its labored breath sent vibrations through the floor. Ethan crouched, studying the creature's wounds. Bite marks, claw gouges, and even burns from what looked like plasma weapons marred its body. "You're telling me no one here can save it?" he asked, glancing at Kalin. Kalin folded his delicate hands, his pale skin shimmering. "Correct. Its biology is too complex, its immune system too aggressive for our methods. Even my advanced, regenerative therapies cannot counteract the systemic collapse. This creature will die within hours." Ethan stood, his brow furrowing. "Well, I guess it's a good thing I'm not here to follow your methods." His voice carried a quiet confidence that made Kalin's serene demeanor falter. Kalin tilted, his head. "Your species is resourceful. But there is a line between resourceful and reckless. I hope you understand this distinction." Ignoring the jab, Ethan gestured to the stretcher. "Let's get it into my operating room. I'll need a full scan, blood samples, and a team to assist." The Kormathi rangers hesitated, exchanging looks. "You'll only prolong its suffering," one muttered. But they complied, moving the hover stretcher into Ethan's surgical bay. The operating room was a frenzy of motion. Alien tech hummed and blinked as Ethan worked alongside an eclectic team of assistants. A nervous-looking humanoid named Relora, a Jelai with shimmering gelatinous appendages, and a squat, grumpy mechanized being called Volt. The initial scans painted a grim picture. The Mazoran bearhound had multiple organ lacerations, a collapsed lung, and a bloodstream teeming with infections. Ethan studied the data, his mind racing. "This isn't just a patch-up job. We're rebuilding this creature from the inside out." Volt's synthetic voice buzzed. "Probability of success, 3.42%. Do you wish to adjust your expectations?" Ethan grinned. "Nope. Let's aim for 100. Relora wrung her hands. "Dr. Kalin's notes say the Mazoran's immune system attacks foreign materials, even sutures. How are you going to fix that?" Ethan glanced at her. "With something its immune system won't recognize as foreign." He rummaged through his supply cart, pulling out a small vial of a biopolymer he'd developed back on Earth. The substance could mimic organic tissue and dissolve harmlessly once healing was complete. "We'll use this for internal repairs." Kalin appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Biopolymer? Primitive. It will fail." "Maybe," Ethan replied without looking up. "But I'm betting it won't." The next hours were grueling. Ethan directed his team with the precision of a battlefield commander. Volt used its mechanical arms to stabilize the Mazoran's vital signs, while Relora and the Jelai assisted with wound cleaning and application of the biopolymer. Ethan himself tackled the most delicate task, repairing the creature's shredded lung. Sweat dripped from his brow as he worked, his hands steady despite the stakes. He used a fusion scalpel to seal the lung tissue, then carefully applied the Biopolymer to reinforce the repairs. How's it looking, Volt? He asked. Vital signs remain critical but stable, the robot replied. Surprising. Kalen watched from the corner, his gaze sharp. You've bought it a few more hours, perhaps, but this is no victory. Ethan straightened, his back aching. You're right. The surgery's only half the battle. Now we need to fight the infection. Kalen arched a translucent brow. And how do you intend to accomplish that? With a cocktail of antibiotics, Ethan said, holding up a syringe, specifically tailored to its physiology. Kalen's expression darkened. Human arrogance. You cannot tailor something to a biology you barely understand. I can try, Ethan shot back, injecting the medication into the Mazoran's massive vein. And trying is better than giving up. Hours turned into a blur as the team monitored the Mazoran bearhound. The creature's breathing grew steadier, though its body remained locked in the precarious balance between life and death. Ethan refused to leave its side, even as exhaustion clawed at him. Kalen, still lingering, finally broke the silence. Your stubbornness is perplexing. Why go to such lengths for a creature you've never seen before? Ethan glanced at him, his expression tired but resolute. Because it deserves a chance. We all do. For the first time, Kalen seemed at a loss for words. He observed the Mazoran, its chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. The creature that had been pronounced beyond saving now lay on the brink of survival. This is only the beginning, Kalen said quietly, his voice devoid of its earlier derision. If it lives, its recovery will be the true test. Ethan nodded. Then I guess I'll have to stick around, won't I? Ethan barely felt the exhaustion settling into his bones as he continued to monitor the Mazoran bearhound. The creature's breathing remained steady but shallow, its body locked in a fragile stasis between survival and failure. The room hummed with the soft beeping of the monitors, and Ethan exhaled, rubbing his face. The hard part was over. Now came the impossible part, keeping it alive long enough to heal. Volt, ever efficient, rotated its optical sensors toward Ethan. You have exceeded standard operating limits for human endurance. Recommendation: sleep cycle. Ethan shook his head. Not happening. Kalen, still hovering near the doorway, narrowed his pale eyes. You mistake stubbornness for skill. This creature's recovery is far from certain. It may still reject the repairs. Its immune system may turn against your antibiotics. You refuse to acknowledge the probability of failure. Ethan smirked without looking up. I acknowledge it. I just don't care. The Mazoran twitched, its body reacting instinctively to the pain despite the heavy sedation. Its claws scraped against the medical bed, and Relora winced. What? If it wakes up and thinks we're a threat? Ethan placed a hand on the beast's massive shoulder. Its fur was thick and coarse, damp with sweat and residual blood. Then we remind it that we're not. Kalen scoffed. Remind an apex? Predator? Ethan looked at him. Every animal understands care, even the deadliest ones. The first real problem arrived 3 hours later. Volt detected it first. Core temperature dropping. Hypothermia risk detected. Ethan moved immediately. Its body's diverting energy to healing. It's shutting down secondary functions. He grabbed a thermal blanket and carefully laid it over the Mazoran's massive frame. Kalen folded his arms. The temperature drop suggests organ stress. This may be the beginning of multi-system failure. Not necessarily, Ethan countered. Already working. He adjusted the intravenous fluids, increasing hydration levels to compensate for the cooling effect. Its metabolism is slowing to preserve energy. If we manage it properly, we can use that to its advantage. Kalen watched with an unreadable expression as Ethan continued his work, adjusting vitals, fine-tuning the balance of electrolytes and nutrients in the creature's IV. Every decision was calculated, every adjustment made with the confidence of someone who had fought death before and refused to lose. Relora, still cautious, kept glancing at the Mazoran's claws. Dr. Cole, do you really think it knows we're helping? Ethan looked at her, then at the Mazoran's barely open eye. The deep, inky blackness of it reflected the dim lights of the medical bay. Yeah, he murmured. I think it does. Mazoran made it through the night. Kalen, to his credit, didn't comment when Ethan finally let his body collapse into a chair, head resting on the metal table beside him. He hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours, and his muscles felt like lead. The moment of peace was brief. A sudden sharp alarm from Volt sent everyone into motion. Heart rate spiking, adrenaline surge detected. Ethan was already on his feet, fighting the fatigue as he moved. The Mazoran's massive form shuddered, its claws flexing against the table. The sedatives were wearing off. Damn it, I was hoping we had more time, Ethan muttered, grabbing a prepared syringe. We need to ease it awake, not let it panic. Kalen took a cautious step back. You do realize it is still an apex predator? If it perceives you as a threat, it won't, Ethan interrupted. Not if we do this right. The Mazoran's breathing grew heavier, its nostrils flaring as it inhaled new scents. Its ear, if it could be called that, twitched at the soft sounds around it. Its body was no longer restrained, but it was still weak. Ethan stepped into its line of vision. Slowly, carefully, he placed a gloved hand against its massive shoulder again. The Mazoran's gaze locked onto him, and for the first time, Ethan saw the depth in its black eyes, pain, confusion, and something else. Something primal, Relora whispered. Is it? The Mazoran rumbled. A deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor. Everyone froze. Kalen tensed. That is not a friendly noise. Ethan didn't move his hand. It's not an aggressive one either. The Mazoran shifted slightly, its muscles weak but functional. It was testing its own body, feeling the injuries, recognizing the pain. It exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. Then, against all odds, let its head drop back onto the table. Relora blinked. Did it just accept us? Ethan grinned. Told you. Kalen was watching, his usual dismissive expression replaced with something else. Contemplation. You are either incredibly lucky, he murmured, or impossibly skilled. Ethan shrugged. Maybe both. Over the next few days, the Mazoran's recovery became a battle of patience and instinct. Ethan adapted its treatment constantly, adjusting pain management, monitoring its appetite, even carefully introducing movement therapy to prevent muscle atrophy. Kalen remained skeptical, but never left. It is still unstable, the alien vet pointed out as he observed Ethan massaging the Mazoran's wounded limbs. You continue to act as if it is simply a large, aggressive canine. Ethan smirked. I've treated worse. Relora, who had grown more comfortable around the creature, observed the way it followed Ethan's movements. It still remained cautious, but the hostility was gone. Then, on the morning of the 5th day, the Mazoran stood. It was shaky, its legs struggling to hold its weight. But it stood. Ethan remained still, letting the creature test its own strength. Its black eyes flicked toward him, then toward Kalen, then back again. Then it did something no one expected. It stepped toward Ethan. Not aggressively, not with territorial intent, but with familiarity. Kalen watched with quiet fascination. It recognizes you, Ethan smiled. Of course it does. For the first time, Kalen didn't argue. He simply watched as the Mazoran, against all logic, against all probability, began to heal. The Mazoran's steps were unsteady but deliberate. Its wounds still ached, and its muscles protested, but it moved, an apex predator defying its own biology, surviving what should have been a fatal encounter. The med bay was silent as everyone watched the impossible unfold. Kalen stood with arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. Fascinating, he murmured, though it sounded more like reluctant admiration than a scientific observation. The Mazoran took another slow step, then another, before lowering itself carefully onto its haunches. Its massive frame remained tense, as if still deciding whether to trust its own body. Ethan didn't move, barely breathed, allowing the creature to settle without interference. Volt, ever analytical, broke the silence. Stability of motor function remains suboptimal. Probability of collapse, 18.76%. Ethan smirked. I like those odds. Kalen exhaled sharply. You continue to gamble with unpredictability. Not a gamble, Ethan corrected. An educated risk. The Mazoran turned its head slightly, its black eyes scanning the room. It was aware of its surroundings, recognizing the beings who had surrounded it for the past days. Relora shifted nervously. "Do you think it realizes we helped?" Ethan nodded. "It knows." The Mazoran didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth. It was wary but not aggressive. That was enough for now. 2 more days passed, and the Mazoran continued to recover at a rate that baffled even Kalen. The wounds were still present, but the biopolymer had done its job, keeping the damaged tissues together long enough for its body to take over. The most pressing concern now was regaining strength. Ethan had dealt with recovering predators before, but never one like this. The Mazoran needed more than rest. It needed movement, stimulation, and, most of all, food. Kalen had been skeptical of Ethan's feeding plan from the start. "Its system is still delicate," he argued, as they stood outside the containment enclosure. Introducing solid food too soon could trigger complications. Ethan held up a nutrient-dense meat ration, specially synthesized for high-metabolism carnivores. And letting it starve isn't an option either. Kalen remained, unconvinced. "If it rejects the food, it will deteriorate rapidly," Ethan sighed. "Which is why we do this carefully." The containment enclosure was a reinforced chamber designed for high-risk patients. Ethan entered slowly, keeping his movements relaxed. The Mazoran, resting on its side, opened its eyes as he approached. He crouched a few meters away, placing the meat ration in front of him. He didn't throw it, didn't push it toward the Mazoran. Instead, he waited. The Mazoran watched him, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. It hesitated. Its body was still weak, an instinct warred with exhaustion. But then, ever so slowly, it stretched its neck forward and took the food. Ethan barely contained his relief as the Mazoran chewed, its body visibly relaxing as it tasted. Real sustenance. From behind the observation glass, Kalen watched with quiet astonishment. "It accepts your presence during feeding. That is unusual." Ethan grinned. "It's called trust." Kalen remained silent. By the 7th day, the Mazoran was moving with increased confidence. It no longer stumbled when it stood, and its appetite had returned. The remaining wounds were still visible, but the rapid healing process had begun, to outpace the damage. Kalen had started spending more time observing than arguing. His skepticism remained, but the undeniable reality of the Mazoran's survival had tempered his doubt. On the morning of the 8th day, the real test arrived. The Kormathi Rangers returned. Ethan had nearly forgotten about them. They had delivered the Mazoran in critical condition, then disappeared while he fought to save it. Now they stood at the entrance of the facility, their chitinous armor gleaming under the artificial lights. One of them, the same ranger who had originally declared the Mazoran beyond saving, stepped forward. "Dr. Cole, we have come to retrieve the Mazoran." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Retrieve?" "The creature was injured in a territorial battle," the ranger said. "It must be returned to its habitat. It is unnatural to keep it here." Ethan exhaled. He had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it easier. He glanced at the Mazoran, who now stood on all 8 legs, watching the exchange. Kalen observed the interaction carefully. "The release of a recovering predator must be done with caution. Premature exposure to its environment could lead to re-injury." The ranger's mandibles twitched. "It will not be confined here forever. That is not its nature." Ethan nodded, slowly. "Then let's do this right." The transport was arranged within the hour. The Mazoran was surprisingly cooperative. Though Ethan suspected it was less about trust and more about instinct, it knew change was coming. The facility's exterior was a vast stretch of reinforced landing platforms, and the transport hovered just beyond the containment field. The jungle beyond was dense and teeming with life, a chaotic expanse of predator and prey. The Mazoran's home. The Kormathi Rangers activated the platform's release mechanism. The containment field lowered, creating an open path between the facility and the wild. For the first time in days, the Mazoran was free. It stepped forward, slowly at first, testing the ground beneath it. Then, with a final glance at Ethan, it moved, not with hesitation, not with fear, with purpose. And then it was gone, vanishing into the jungle. Relora exhaled. I can't believe it. Kalen stood beside Ethan, watching the tree line. Your methods were unorthodox, reckless, highly improbable. Ethan smirked. But they worked. Kalen inclined his head slightly. Yes, they did. The jungle remained still for a moment longer. Then, in the distance, a deep, resonant growl echoed through the trees. Not a warning. A farewell. The jungle swallowed the Mazoran whole, its immense form vanishing into the dense undergrowth. The final growl still echoed through the air, a sound that sent a shiver through the gathered team. Not of fear, but of understanding. Ethan let out a slow breath. It was over. Weeks of work, sleepless nights, and a battle against biology itself, and now the Mazoran was where it belonged. He should have felt relief, satisfaction even. Instead, there was an odd hollowness in his chest. Relora broke the silence first. I didn't think I'd feel this weird about it leaving. Ethan gave a tired smile. That's how it works. You fight for something, and when it finally happens, it doesn't feel the way you expect. Kalen, still watching the jungle, let out a thoughtful hum. Fascinating. Ethan shot him a side glance. You keep saying that. What exactly do you find so fascinating? Kalen turned his pearl-like eyes toward him. Your insistence, your defiance, your utter disregard for probability. He clasped his hands behind his back. Every species in the galaxy understands the limits of nature. They respect those limits. And yet, you humans, you do not accept them at all. Ethan chuckled. That a compliment? Kalen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It is an observation. The Kormathi Rangers had already begun their departure, their business concluded. The Mazoran had survived. That was all that mattered to them. To Ethan, though, it was more than that. The team returned to the facility, the weight of the past days settling into the silence. There was no need to speak. The work had been done. But the question lingered. What now? 3 days passed. Ethan spent the time catching up on sleep, cleaning the medbay, and pretending he wasn't constantly checking the jungle perimeter whenever he stepped outside. The facility's routine had returned to normal, as if the Mazoran had never been there at all. Kalen had returned to his usual clinical demeanor, though there was something different about his presence now. He stayed longer in the medbay, observing Ethan's work with an attentiveness that wasn't entirely critical. On the morning of the 4th day, Volt detected movement near the outer perimeter. Ethan was halfway through a diagnostic scan when the alert chimed through the facility. Volt's mechanical voice followed immediately after. Unidentified life form approaching. Size and mass consistent with previous subject. Ethan froze. No way, Relora bolted upright. You don't think... Ethan was already moving, crossing the medbay in quick strides. He reached the main entrance just as the external monitors activated, displaying a grainy image of the jungle clearing beyond the containment field. And there it was. The Mazoran stood at the edge of the tree line, its massive frame illuminated by the facility's landing lights. It wasn't injured, wasn't struggling. It was simply there, watching. Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on the control panel to open the outer door. Kalen's voice stopped him. You assume it is here for you. Ethan turned to look at him. You don't? Kalen hesitated. The Mazoran took a step closer, slow and deliberate. Then another. It was still cautious, still keeping a respectable distance, but it was approaching. Ethan walked outside. Relora made a small noise of concern but didn't stop him. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and jungle foliage. Ethan moved carefully, closing the gap between them by only a few steps. He didn't reach out, didn't try to force anything. He simply stood there, letting the Mazoran decide. The creature's black eyes locked onto him. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, in an action so subtle it might have been imagined, the Mazoran lowered its head slightly. Acknowledgement. Ethan grinned. Didn't expect to see you again. The Mazoran rumbled softly, a sound that held no aggression. Relora, standing just behind the door, whispered, "It came back." Kalen remained still, his gaze fixed on the interaction. "No, it returned." There was a difference. Ethan exhaled, the last remnants of doubt washing away. The Mazoran wasn't just an animal he had saved. It was something more. A connection. A promise.